Greetings and salutations, young true believers. I want to talk to you about Alain de Botton's interview in philosophybites.com on architecture. Obviously, we're talking about architecture this week. Architecture, as I noted earlier in the previous video, is an art form that many commentators regard as a compromised art form. Wittgenstein, the 20th century philosopher, once famously quipped that if you think philosophy is hard, try being a good architect, right? Meaning that this is the debate surrounding architecture. Architecture is necessarily a compromised art form because you always have to take into account the bodily needs of human beings, right? And Botton has written several books on architecture. Um, he's one of the most famous thinkers with respect to architecture right now, alive today. And Botton has some interesting theses regarding um, architecture. And one of my favorite examples that he uses in this interview is he talks about garden gnomes, right? And you see garden gnomes everywhere. You know, we're all familiar with the Travelocity gnome. You know, uh, what's the motto or the slogan? Go explore or something like that. Anyway, um, but Tom wants to ask, okay, well, what is it about the garden gnome, right? And he provocatively and plausibly, I would argue, uh, contends that the garden gnome represents a lack of something in someone's life. What's it lacking? Well, he calls it sweetness, right? And he talks about the people. People have a desire for beauty, right? It's very ingrained in human beings to like beautiful things. That's why, for example, to give you a kind of mundane example of this, and something that intrinsically in and of itself isn't particularly valuable, right? But gold and silver, right? Just they're metals, right? And gold is has applications in electroplating, right, and conductivity, but generally there are other copper with respect to its disinfectant qualities, right? And that's why so many hospitals use it. It's much more valuable in that respect, but people like beautiful things. Gemstones, right? They have no application whatsoever outside of jewelry, but people like color, right? We love beautiful, vibrant color. So most people, as Baton points out, are not. They don't have the resources such that they can, dictate what their homes are going to look like on the outside, right? They're at the mercy of what he calls landlord kitsch, right? And we all know what that is. It's the that really cheap pile uh, carpeting that most landlords use. It's the standard white paint inside of an apartment building. There's nothing really beautiful about most apartment complexes. It, certainly not in the United States, and not in most places of the world, right? And if people have garden gnomes out in front of their apartments, or they have, pink flamingos, right? I mean, what that says is that the people have, this longing for sweetness, which is to say, a longing for beauty that just simply is not being met in their day-to-day lives, right? And this is all the more so given, as we talked about it last module, Sequeros pointed out, right? The general conception of art these days is art is something you stick in a bag, you buy it, you stick it in a bag, you take it home, and you display it at home. We don't have much in the way of public art. Most public art in most major metropolitan areas is centered downtown, and maybe, you know, you'll have a mural or two in a few neighborhoods, and that's about it, right? People, put it this way, uh, psychologists and anthropologists talk about people being touch starved in or touch deprived in our society, right? Well, to a certain extent, we're beauty deprived, right? Um, and there's a need for it. There's a very psychological need. Now, does it outweigh other, considerations, ethical considerations? No, but it's not. It's not nothing, and it's not something that we should necessarily sneeze at, right? And what does beauty signify in our life? Well, in this last paragraph, this last bit of the interview, uh, Botton talks about what he wants his building, what he thinks an ideal building, a beautiful building, should convey, right? And he tells Nigel Warburton, he's talking about the Tate Modern Museum in London, right? If someone asked, what would one like life in Britain to be like? I'd answer, I'd like life in Britain to be a bit like Tate Modern. That is to project qualities of civic mindedness, of community, a kind of domestic quality, and a life that's still quite dignified. The idea that something could be for everybody, but of very high quality. It's a building which interestingly fuses the past and the present, which is something that British life is very cut up and divided about, and I would say American life too, for that matter, right? So that's a building which is not just a good building, but it's almost like a good person, a good modern British person, right? So that's that. Baton hits on something very important here, which is this notion that something high quality anything is something that's reserved for a very few, and not for the masses. And that's an idea that obviously needs to change. And that's part of consideration behind his observation that we're beauty deprived. So when you're reading through the pieces in the text on architecture, and we'll talk more about this next week, think about these considerations, right? Uh, can a building really be thoroughly beautiful, or is architecture always necessarily compromised? And what role does the appreciation of beauty play in our lives?